Okay, hello and welcome to On Brand with Alf and me, Rory Sutherland. Each month I'll be talking to household names as well as challenger brands about success, challenges and future opportunities in the advertising, marketing and media industries. And today I'm joined by two guests. Firstly, Jonathan Wolfe, co-founder and CEO at ZOE, the science and nutrition company. Secondly, Sharlene Lopez, founder of Medifesto, was founded in 2012 as the first branding agency serving the health technology sector. Now, ZOE was founded by a team of three, a geneticist, an engineer, and a tech specialist. That sounds like a really bad start of a really bad joke, but it isn't. It was literally a geneticist, an engineer, and a tech specialist who set up the company with the aim to improve the health of millions. Since its launch, more than 130,000 people have signed up to ZOE's personalised nutrition program in the UK and the USA, including, as we'll hear, quite a number of celebrities. ZOE customers can be spotted by the circular yellow arm patch, which means they're wearing a blood sugar sensor. Recently, ZOE launched its first food supplement, Daily 30. It's a whole food supplement containing over 30 plants. Now, Sharlene's been brand building in the healthcare sector for global pharmaceutical companies such as Imperial College London and GSK for many years, and like most of us, is very familiar with ZOE. So, Jonathan and Sharlene, first of all, welcome to the podcast. And we'll start maybe with a question for you, Jonathan. 7 years ago, I think, you co-founded ZOE with George Hadjigeorgiou, an engineer, and Tim Spector, who's the professor of genetics and a familiar figure on TV and radio. Since its launch, ZOE has generated huge social and PR coverage with the help of well-known ambassadors such as Davina McCall, Stephen Bartlett from Dragon's Den, and of course, Diary of a CEO. So we'll go right back to the beginning. What led you to launching ZOE and what makes it unique?
Thank you, Rory. And I'd never realized that my founding was sort of like one of those jokes where three people walk into a pub. So I'm going to have to rethink the whole way I talk about this in the future. So that's not how I thought about it at the time. So my background, actually, I was chief product officer at a company called Criteo, which might be familiar to quite a few of your listeners because this is marketing technology. And we invented something called personalized retargeting. So if you've ever been stalked across the internet by a pair of shoes or a holiday home, that is basically my fault. And so I'd spent 7 years there. The company had gone from sort of 30 people to 2,000 people and more than $1 billion of revenue. So been very, very successful using an amazing amount of technology. Like at the time, by the time I left, there were more than 500 engineers in Paris. You know, many of them, I would say, the smartest engineers in France, because that was before there was a Google or a Facebook or any of these people in France. This was like the most exciting tech company there. And they were spending all their effort to get you to click slightly more often on an ad in order to buy slightly more shoes.
I will, by the way, when consumers complain about being stalked by shoes, and of course, occasionally they have bought the shoes and they're still being stalked, in which case I sympathize. On the other hand, you could argue that someone who has become very close to buying a pair of shoes is literally 20,000 times more likely to buy that pair of shoes in the future than someone selected at random. So it is a behavior which, although irritating to the consumer, kind of makes sense, doesn't it? We ought to defend that, I think.
So I don't feel bad about doing Criteo. I think what I realized was, like, ultimately we help companies to sell some more shoes. We help to pay for publishers to run their sites. But I didn't feel like I was making the world a much better place. And a couple of years after we went public on NASDAQ, I decided that I wanted to leave and do something that felt more important to me. At the time, I had just one son who was about 7. I've talked about this on the ZOE podcast quite a few times. And I just realized I didn't pay any attention to what I did, Rory. He only paid attention to what he didn't pay any attention to what I said. He only paid attention to like what I was actually doing. And so I was like, it felt important to me to explain to him at this point what my values were, and just continuing to work at Criteo wasn't going to do that. I wanted to do something that I felt like he could understand what was important and what wasn't. So I left Criteo. I had no idea what I was going to do. And entirely by chance, I ended up meeting my co-founder, Professor Tim Spector. And he was actually doing a public talk around his first book about the microbiome, which was called The Diet Myth. And to me, it was just like this sort of amazing hour. I had no idea that like inside me were these trillions of bacteria, that they were actually more important for my health than almost anything else. And basically, if I fed them the right food, they were going to do all these magical things for me. But if I fed them the sort of diet that I actually was eating at the time, I wasn't doing anything good for them at all.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the microbiome doesn't share any of our DNA, does it? So in other words, Correct. There may be more cells in the microbiome than there are in our body. But because they don't actually share our DNA, it's fair to say they don't necessarily have our best interests at heart.
Well, so what's interesting is I think if you went back to sort of speak to doctors 20 years ago, they say, oh, yeah, you've got these bugs inside you. Maybe they're harmless, or maybe they can do all like bad things if they get out of line. And so you should just keep taking antibiotics. Anytime there's anything wrong, take antibiotics, kill them. What we now know, Rory, actually, is that most of the bacteria inside us are good for us. And actually, ZOE has published a series of papers in Nature Medicine and elsewhere discovering a whole set of bacteria that we now know are really good for us. So we actually talk now about sort of 50 good bugs, 50 bad bugs. And what's happening with these good bugs is you think about each of these microbes, each of these little bacteria, it's sort of like a little chemical factory. What happens is they eat what we eat, right? So that's what goes into this little factory. And then they create all these chemicals that we don't normally get. We don't get them just from our food. And we are built to have all of this bacteria inside us, right? All of our ancestors forever, in fact, basically almost every like multicellular organism has these bacteria inside it. And those chemicals, they then cross, from the gut into our blood, and they go everywhere. And so what's interesting, in the last couple of years, we understand it's not just like our metabolism that it helps. So it's not just that it's good for like our heart, but we now understand it has really big impact on our brain. So we know that it affects our mood, our energy, and there's even new studies now suggesting that it really affects risks of things like dementia. So I think the answer is you should think about these bacteria as being your friends, but then if you're looking after them inside you, you also have to say, well, am I eating the right food to feed these bacteria? And that was really the start of ZOE, is discovering this from Tim.
And in fact, they actually affect personality, if that's right. That's true as well, isn't it?
So I don't think that there's any like proven clinical trials that sort of say that they shape your personality. I think what is clear is that they affect mood. And there is I think increasingly strong evidence that, so there's very strong evidence, for example, that if you change the food that you're eating, you can have a significant impact on serious diseases like depression in very short periods of time. And that actually changing the food you eat is as effective as the most effective drugs that are currently being used to deal with clinical depression, which is just, I think, a sign of how much food really is medicine. It doesn't mean that medicine isn't also a good thing, but just how much the food we eat matters to us. And I think maybe just to finish the story of ZOE is I think the key thing that I also realized over time since starting ZOE is that we live in this environment where we're surrounded by terrible food that is making us really unhealthy, and that if we are able to change the sort of food that we eat, if we make smarter food choices, we can really transform how we feel very rapidly. So feel more energy, feel more mood, but also put ourselves on the path for many more healthy years. But it's hard because we're in this food environment where almost everything that's being pushed to us by probably, again, some of the cleverer marketers on this call is playing on our worst instincts, and it's really hard to resist. It's ultra processed food. And if you're listening to this in the UK, we now eat by far the highest levels of ultra processed foods in Europe, and our children eat the highest level of ultra processed food in the world.
That's the UK is literally the highest in the world.
For children, it is the worst in the world.
That's intriguing. How do you define ultra processed as distinct from processed?
So, so one of the things that ZOE does is we do a lot of science. And right from the very beginning, we said, when I asked Tim if he wanted to come and sort of create something, taking his science and turning it into something that could be useful for people. So could we take all of this science? He's one of the top 100 most cited scientists in the world, so very, very credible. But the reason why he started writing these books is he wanted to make an impact actually on the world and on people's health. And I said, well, look, what you're saying is very complicated, and food is really complicated. And you're also saying everybody has different bacteria inside their gut. So the right food is not exactly the same, Rory, for you as it is for me, as it is for Sharlene. you've done this, all these studies, but actually you're not able to tell people what to do. That's really what AI and data science is for. And that's what I had been doing at Criteo before. What about if we take all of your science, we create the idea that, you can, anyone can join ZOE, they can give us data, they could do a test to give us more information, and then we can personalize that advice, but also we can use an app to help you to understand step by step how to make changes. And amazingly, Tim said, yes, that's a great idea. However, I'll only do that if you do the real science to make it work, because that science doesn't exist. There isn't enough data out there to do that. He said to go and do that, we'd have to do a massive study, like the biggest nutrition science study that's ever been done, in order to start doing this. And I'm not interested unless you do that. And so he said afterwards, he said, like, I left and George left. He thought he'd never see us again. He's like, well, they're gone. And we came back 3 weeks later and we said, well, we've raised the $7 million to go and do this study. Can we start tomorrow? And Tim was like, oh, I guess I'm committed now. So that was the start of ZOE.
You called his bluff. Perfect.
I called his bluff. And for the next 3 years, it was basically a pure science experiment. We had 1,000 people, almost all of them twins, mainly in the UK, 100 in Mass General Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts as well, to get this raw data to understand how all of these different individuals respond to food, and also understanding how much of that was genetics and how much wasn't. And what we discovered, which is really interesting, is that almost everything that I had been taught is wrong. And actually, I would say my story of the last 8 years, Rory, is that almost everything I knew about food turns out to be wrong. And every year I discover more that is also wrong. But in this case, I'd always assumed that basically, what happened to you later in life is entirely driven by your genes and also your upbringing, right? So you can completely blame your mum and dad, right? Because they gave you your genes, they brought you up, and you have no responsibility. But it turns out it's not true at all. Actually, your genes have a very small impact on how you're responding to food once you're grown up. And actually, your microbiome, right? So these trillions of bacteria we've been talking about is much more important. But your overall lifestyle is much more important, and the food that you eat shapes this over time.
So you must notice, I'm just guessing here, I mean, the temptation to consume high sugar and salt products is always going to be there. Do you have a huge ZOE sign-up season in January? Does it coincide with the New Year's resolution?
So firstly, ZOE as a commercial entity is still quite early, Rory. So we ended up doing this science for a very long time. So we did 3 years of science, then COVID happened and we sort of pivoted for a couple of years. We're very, very involved in trying to fight COVID. So we actually only launched the product really about 2.5 years ago. And the reason I'm saying that is, our understanding of the cyclicality is still early. Yeah. If I compare that to most businesses, right, that have many years of trading. And the answer is yes. What we see basically is that the day after Christmas Day, suddenly everyone says, you know what, I've got to start thinking about my health. There's a further sort of acceleration as you get to New Year's Day. I think for everyone, it's like, you know what, I'm going to worry about it after New Year's Eve. And I think people wake up, and particularly, if anyone's listening here in the UK or the East Coast of the States, right? If these are northerly places that are cold, I think you wake up in January, you sort of had all those nice things, Thanksgiving and Christmases and whatever. And then suddenly you wake up in January and you're feeling bad about yourself. It's dark. You've probably not been taking good shape. And it is this point where you suddenly sort of reassess. And so I think the answer is that yes, people think a lot about how they can be healthy. I think the danger is lots of people say, I'm going to do something really extreme. I'm going to make a whole bunch of commitments that are impossible. They set themselves up to fail because they're just I'm going to do everything, right? I'm going to give up all alcohol. I'm going to eat no gluten and no dairy, all the rest of it. And I'm going to the gym 5 days a week. And sure enough, by middle of January, you've not managed to keep all of those. You're depressed and you give it all up. This is not this is setting yourself up to fail. So I think the good thing is, I think it's great to say, I want to go and improve my health. I think we really believe that everyone has an amazing ability to improve their health. And I have been interviewing all of these scientists so ZOE has its own podcast and been interviewing all these amazing scientists now for the last couple of years. And I think what's really interesting is across all disciplines, whether you're talking to people, talking about the microbiome or talking about nutrition or talking about exercise, is that no matter how old you are, actually, if you make a change in one of those things, you can see the impact in like real blood markers in just a couple of months. And so I think, there is this amazing thing. It's not too late. No matter where you are, you can always make an improvement. But it's not going to make any difference if you just do it for a month. So what you've got to think about is, how do I make a change that I can stick with? And so that change has to be sensible, and it's step by step. And in my own case, I would say I've been on an 8-year journey with my nutrition, where every time someone asks me, it's like, oh, now I've got it all figured out. And then if you ask me a year later, it's like, oh, no, I've changed stuff because I've been talking to all these other people and realizing that actually there was other things I didn't know, or just that my own abilities have changed. Like if I think about what I eat now and enjoy, like I just would have been like, oh, you'd never like that, Jonathan. That's all like, it sounds disgusting.
So to some extent, it is self-reinforcing because you recalibrate your food preferences over time as part of the program.
Absolutely. And I think part of the reason that happens is it turns out that is your microbes themselves. So there are some really interesting, rather shocking studies that suggest that, if you were to eat McDonald's, even for like a couple of weeks nonstop, you see this profound shift in the bacteria inside your gut. And they're creating all of these chemicals, and there may be some sort of reinforcement loop that's making you crave all of this ultra processed food. And you asked me at the beginning, like, what is ultra processed food? Like, I think the best definition I've heard is food with a whole set of ingredients in that you could never find in your kitchen. So if you look at the ingredients label, it's got all sorts of things like gums and emulsifiers and sweeteners, none of which you ever buy in the supermarket and put into your food, but which are basically like only could do in a sort of massive, laboratory. That's basically ultra processed food. And I think what's shocking is this ultra processed food is hiding in a lot of places. So, for example, most of the fast food that you eat, actually, it's full of ultra-processed ingredients. And most of the ready meals that you would buy in a supermarket are full of these ingredients if you turn it over. And of course, the junk food that we're all familiar with, we're not surprised now, I think, to discover is full of these. And so sweeteners is a great example of that, where I was always taught, sweetener, right? Like it tastes sweet, but it has no impact on you whatsoever. It's 0 calories. And so one of the mysteries of the world is like we all gave up the fat Coke for the Diet Coke, right? But none of us lost any weight. We now understand, and there's some really interesting new science on this, some of these sweeteners are having a real impact on our bacteria, and those bacteria are then being influenced. And so these sorts of ultra-processed foods are having an effect that we don't really understand. But I think what's scary is we are running this experiment, on our children and on ourselves, in a way in which I think many of us would prefer that we had better data before we did that.
And it's interesting. So you almost need to rethink your diet in the sense that you're feeding your microbiome or the good components of it. In other words, you have this kind of inner creature which is separate from you. Do you see what I mean?
I absolutely do. And this is how I try and...
It's a sort of Tamagotchi. It's almost a kind of Tamagotchi model of how to eat.
I love the way that you go there. And this is sort of exactly the way that I explain it to, my daughter who's only 5. Because I think trying to tell, I was always like, eat your vegetables. It's not a very like appealing story, but understanding that like you've got these good bugs and they need some stuff like the Tamagotchi you're describing, I think is very powerful, and it just helps to reframe this a bit. So it's not like you therefore have to be perfect either. It's more like saying, how do you add? One of the key things about ZOE always is, how do you add food into your diet that is going to support your health? So it's less about taking things away. It's not all about deprivation. It's not like give up things. Actually, it's really about adding a lot. And once you start to think about your body as needing all of these things, I think it helps you to make that change. And as you said, the good news is you will shift what you like quite fast. We are trained to eat food that I think our ancestors would have considered baby food. And they're like, how do you eat that all the time? But we've got so used to it.
Yes.
But actually, once you wean yourself off, quite fast, you discover, I really like this stuff that has crunch. And actually, even after, 4 weeks with less sugar, you get all the same sweet response you had before. You've just sort of like lowered the requirement. So
because there's an absolute bugger in the food industry, which is sugar and salt and things. aren't necessarily added for taste reasons, but as a bulking agent. I think that's right, isn't it?
They're used for lots of different. I'm not a nutritional scientist, so what I understand. So what you have to say is, once you start to like really turn these foods into stuff that's not really food, and so you take a yogurt, right, and you rip out all the fat. If you take all the fat out of a yogurt, it's disgusting. So no one wants to eat that. So what do? Well, you go and put in lots of sugar into it,
of course,
to make up for the fact, and you add like weird gums, so you get that sort of lovely feel of the fat. And so you create this new product that's really been designed to say, well, I wanted to make a low-fat yogurt because the government.
And sure enough, you have
30 years ago,
you have made, of course,
you have made a low-fat yogurt. The problem is, and the government advice, by the way, was like eating low fat is good for your health. We now know that is one of many, many diet myths. It's absolutely not true. And actually shifting from that full-fat yogurt to that low-fat yogurt that I just described is going to be worse for almost everybody. So they do this.
And it also varies, if I'm right, it varies by person. So there are people who look at insulin spikes after eating. That seems to vary a great deal between different people. Is that right? What foods actually spike their insulin levels? You would have assumed it was a simple kind of glucose calculation, but apparently it's weirdly more individual than that. Is that right?
That's right. So I think I described earlier how my co-founder Tim said, well, before we can do any product, we've got to go and do this really big science study. And today ZOE is actually running the world's largest nutrition science study. And everyone who joins and becomes a member can choose to participate in that. But in that first study with 1,000 people, we were really looking at these personalized responses. And what we found, which was really a big shock for all the scientists involved, is there's this huge variation between people in terms of how we respond to the same food. And so what can happen is that, I might eat, porridge, oats for breakfast, and my wife might eat it, and you might look at what happens to my blood sugar. And in my case, my blood sugar spikes really high.
Which you wouldn't expect with porridge, which has got a low glycemic index normally.
The theory was that you wouldn't expect that, but actually I see this huge spike, and then my wife might eat it, and it still spikes, but not as much. And so we see this big variation. And we see the same thing in terms of responding to fatty foods. So you could have somebody who eats 2 avocados and a bunch of olive oil. That's really healthy fat. I actually have almost no response to that. Somebody else might have a higher response. And so we see these variations. In my case, it turns out my fat control was quite good. My blood sugar control was very bad. And there I was eating a diet that was full of starch, was not a good place to be. And that's one of the first big shifts that I made as I ended up sort of discovering ZOE for myself.
I'll move on to Sharlene now. So, Sharlene, you worked in the health technology sector for quite a few years. Well, actually, I'm going to ask you the first question. How did you get into it? And how important do you believe that brand and marketing is in supporting just the adoption and spread of health technology solutions?
Yeah, I think listening to this conversation about nutrition is really interesting. Before the days of ZOE, this is the days of Gillian McGee. Do you remember when she was criticized for trying to add pseudoscience to food? And people like Delicious Yellow. Before all of that, I worked in the clinical nutrition arena. And what was really interesting was actually that nutrition itself, it just didn't have the kind of credibility of other areas of healthcare. So one of the issues that we came across when I was working in the clinical nutrition was enteroparental nutrition, was actually that GPs don't have any training in nutrition. It just doesn't factor at all. And we look at the food that's available within hospitals. I think we're trying to change that now, but the food that's available in hospitals is not supportive of recovery and health. And I think those key opportunities that we missed at the GP and all of those kind of healthcare touch points, I think we really missed the opportunity to raise the awareness of healthcare and supporting your healthcare, maintaining good health, which is what the conversation is about now. The NHS are trying to go from sick care to preventative care. And one of the challenges we came up with was medicines management, who were making the decisions about prescriptions of clinical nutrition, just weren't informed on it. Didn't see it as anything that had a real impact on any of the healthcare outcomes. And actually it was a real shift in helping them to understand the importance of nutrition as a foundational impact on recovery times, bed times, falls in care homes. And I think what I see that ZOE has managed to do through their brand is they've managed to make nutrition scientific, which has therefore seemed to give it more of a credibility. And I think there's been a huge vacuum there. The NHS hasn't picked it up. Public health has in part, but not really to a very great degree, I don't think. And I think that's the vacuum that I see that ZOE has managed to fill. They've managed to make nutrition scientific, and I think raised its value in the eyes of everybody in terms of looking after your health, that it's a key factor.
I also think that the acknowledgement of the importance of the microbiome is central to us understanding this. And I don't just mean science understanding it, I mean the public understanding it. Because what you tended to have was either very crude heuristics like, it's fresh, therefore it's natural, it's frozen, therefore it's unnatural. Okay. And you also had, I assume, Jonathan, you're a skeptic about calories in, calories out. Are you pretty much?
Absolutely. The science is clear that it doesn't work for the vast majority of people.
Okay. So, I mean, I always think marketing and understanding, in a sense, marketing and understanding gut science, the first step is to understand that this is complex. We need a fundamentally new mental model in the public in terms of their approach to diet. And I think what everybody's been trying to do effectively is to come up with, I mean, there are useful heuristic rules, I'm sure, but I think what we've got to do is start with the science and then develop the heuristics. Whereas what we've done is we've done it the other way around, in a way.
I think where the public health campaigns around nutrition have gone wrong is it's been very prohibitive. You mustn't do this and you mustn't do that. Whereas I think with things like, I mean, particularly going on diets, I think what ZOE's got right is their whole, and I'm actually a ZOE fan, I'm not a member, but I just bought the recipe book. And I really like this ethos that it's about, I can do positive things. So I think with exercise, you do it and it's done. You can tick the box. Whereas dieting has always been the other way around. And nutrition's always been the other way around. I have to all day not do something.
Yes.
And I think it's the same thing when we've looked at smoking cessation programs, that you're all day not doing something. And once you can reframe that, for example, in smoking cessation, is saying, actually, I normally smoke 20 a day. Today, I have not done this 20 times. And when you can start adding numbers and making this an additive factor rather than today I'll smoke 0, actually you can start seeing much more of that kind of gain feedback that you get, which then motivates you to carry on the cycle. And I think smoking cessation and dieting have got the same kind of thing. I think that's where Zoe's been very clever. I can do something today. I can tick the box. I've done it. I've added seeds on my toast this morning. I've done this. And I think that's where they've been really, really clever. This idea of abundance and trying lots of different things and adding things, I think has been a really clever approach.
Tell me a bit of your origin story. So you've worked for GSK, is that right? You've worked for a couple of the large pharma companies.
Yeah.
And then you effectively got into effectively taking marketing skills honed there and taking them into kind of the behavioural change area, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So I worked in I started my career in life sciences, probably about 10, 15 years working with the large ones. Yeah. And I think life sciences are very aware about brand. This was the time you had the blockbuster branding. Things have obviously changed now, but they were very brand centered. And that's what we used to do was, look at how do we build the brand? How do we reinforce the brand? How do we do brand value add? And then coming over to the health tech world, what's been really interesting is they're either founded normally by clinical founders or by people who are tech and want to do good and so go into healthcare. That's the kind of majority of the kind of profiles that we see. And I think they're really missing a step in terms of brand. There seems to be a huge focus on product. The fight over engineers and health techs is enormous. There's a huge demand on them. There's huge pressure on them to get the next features and benefits out. And I think there's a real gap here, which is where my agency Medifesto has been working on, is how do we, all of those values and ethics that you've put into your product, how do you get them into the brand and how do you make them be part of the whole brand experience? And I think that's something that people don't really think about. They think about, this is the clinical evidence. We can evidence that we're the best brand, we're the best product, we're the best healthcare outcomes. But that doesn't make you win. When you look, I compare it to mobile phones. You look at mobile phones. I haven't a clue on the tech spec of all of the phones in the category. I just know that I like mine. It fits in my pocket, it fits in my hand, and does the 2 or 3 things that were essential I wanted it to do. And I think we need to recognize that whilst healthcare is scientific based and health tech is based on science and it has to be evidence-based and you have to improve healthcare outcomes, they all do. They all have to. That's the cost of entry. So you have to have what's that angle that you can have. And I really do think it's this brand experience piece that we're missing within health tech, that life sciences inherently new and health tech are a bit slow to adopt.
No, I can see that. And it's also because you have this problem in any tech group, which is, it's just as prevalent in advertising, that a large part of everybody's motivation is to impress their peer group. And therefore,